Alright lads, welcome back to the channel. My last tutorial on Naval did pretty well, but unfortunately, I made it pretty much right before they updated the Naval aiming system. So I'm going to quickly go over it again, and because Naval is such, well, it's not a rare game, but not many people play it because they see it as quite daunting to get into. It's really not, so hopefully I can persuade a few new players to actually try it. I do actually really like the Naval gameplay inside War Thunder, however I do understand that it is rather broken at the minute. It's very hard to actually grind out the big ships because the battleships face off against light cruisers, so it's very hard to grind. But anyway, this is a no-nonsense tutorial, so let's get straight into it. Starting off, we have two types of ship. We have the coastal vessel and the blue water vessel. These naval vessels are available for the United States, Germany, the USSR, Great Britain, Japan and Italy. However, in the near future, France is also likely to get access to ships. As I said, the ships are split into two categories, coastal and blue water. As you can imagine, the coastal fleet consists of mainly small littoral ships, basically PT boats, as well as few coastal frigates really. Whereas the blue water section comprises everything from destroyers up to battleships. Both the coastal and the blue water vessels share the same battle rating structure and also fight in the same battles. The way this works is in War Thunder, the majority of the maps have several different spawn points. As you can see on this map, the bigger ships spawn out towards the open ocean, whereas the smaller coastal vessels typically spawn around islands. This allows all the different types of ships in War Thunder to fight in the same match with a reasonable degree of fairness. This is quite a good thing, as at the start of a game it is just important to dominate the big open ocean as it is to dominate the small coastal areas, as there are typically cap circles in both of these locations. So while the coastal vessels aren't particularly sexy, they don't really draw a lot of players into them compared to the big battleships, they are still very important in a naval match. Now that we've talked about the different types of ships, let's talk about how these vessels work. And for that, we'll take a look in the crew skills. First of all, under the ship commander we have leadership. This basically is the same as all other commander skills, similar to the commander skill in the tank section. It basically improves everything slightly. We then have the crew interchangeability perk. This is basically your health bar. In War Thunder, a ship's health is determined basically by how many crew it has remaining. This is a little bit of an oversimplification, but for new players, this is a pretty decent understanding of how it works. Then under the gunner section we have the main caliber reload speed. No points for guessing what this does, it just increases how fast you reload, similar to a tank skill. We then have the damage control section, which, as you might guess, is how quickly you can deal with damage, including flooding, fire extinguishing, the repair of damaged hull, as well as survival leadership, which basically allows your crew to multitask. Again, don't be put off by these crew skills, it is a little bit complicated, but just as a general rule, ships with higher crew counts tend to be more survivable. This crew system has led to some controversy, mainly when Gaijin added the premium Prince Eugen, a ship which has a higher crew count than the tech tree ship of the same class, the Admiral Hipper. This meant that the premium version was more survivable than the tech tree one, leading to accusations of pay to win. But you get what I'm trying to say. While the armour of a ship is important, the real factor in determining the survivability of ships in War Thunder is the high crew count. It basically acts the same way as War Thunder tanks. If you knock out a majority of the crew, the ship dies essentially. Because the survivability of a vessel determines on its crew count, the smaller coastal craft tend to be very easy to kill. This means combat between coastal vessels tends to have a very short kill time, which can make it quite hard for newer players trying to play coastal vessels. It's basically like jumping straight into COD 4 multiplayer. The time to kill is very short, and you'll basically get ass blasted by some veteran. Because of this, if you're a new player, I'd strongly recommend starting with the blue water destroyers. There are lots of premium destroyers available for very low price, around 250 golden eagles if I'm not mistaken. These aren't the best destroyers in the world, but they're pretty fun to play, relatively stress free, which is always a bonus, and more importantly, because all of these destroyers have 3 to 4 guns, the time to kill is actually quite long, making it rather forgiving for a newer player who is both trying to understand the mechanics behind the game and trying to master the aiming system. Now, the fact I use master the aiming system rather implies that this is hard to do. Gaijin have tried to make this easier. Personally, I preferred the old system, but I can see the merit in the new system. Let's talk a little bit about the aiming system. If you go to the American tech tree, click on the blue water feat, find the USS Moffat in the 3rd rank on the right hand side, right click and press test drive, or test sail I guess. It doesn't really matter what ammunition you take, just press OK in the bottom right hand side of the screen. Alright, so we're now in a test sail. We're going to press the shift key, which for me brings up the aiming system. I am then going to find our target, which is the German destroyer, and press my middle mouse button to lock it as a target. You'll notice that we immediately get a ranging system. Now the crew skills which I spoke about earlier determines how accurate this range estimation is. The higher your crew skills, the more accurate the range, allowing you to get a more accurate shot with your first round. Don't worry though, even with a stock crew, these range estimates are pretty decently accurate. The extra crew points just make it even accurater, if that's a word, which I don't think it is. Anyway, you'll notice that we have a chevron crosshair. This is your basic aiming point, or point of reference. We then also have a green circle with a line in it. This is our predicted fall of shot. So you basically want to put this little green circle just where the ship meets the waterline. Remember, in shipping or ship and ship engagements, punching holes in the top of a ship doesn't sink it. You have to punch holes under the water. So you always want to be aiming for your shells to hit just at the waterline to try and create lots of flooding. So as you can see, I've just taken a shot and our rounds land pretty much on target. Now, I'm stationary and so is our target. This is pretty much never going to be the case in an actual battle. You will almost always be moving away from each other or towards each other on different vectors. This has led to some frustration from people first starting it, as it is quite hard to aim correctly. However, from experience, after you play a few games, this does become second nature. And again, if you start off playing the destroyers, which have low caliber, high rates of fire guns, you can pretty much spam shots until you find the target range. But as a general rule, if you are travelling faster than an enemy ship, you want to be shooting slightly behind it. And alternatively, if an enemy ship is moving faster than you want to be shooting in front of it. Those are pretty much basic rules that aren't too hard to remember. Now, this doesn't mean you have to go out and memorise the top speeds of all the ships in game. To be honest, most ships in War Thunder have around the same top speed. So this rule about the speed is more if you're fighting against a different type of ship. For example, if you're in a battleship and you're firing at an enemy destroyer, it's almost certainly going to be moving faster than you, so you have to give it quite a lot of lead. But if the roles are reversed and you are travelling faster against a slower target, you will obviously have to shoot behind it, or in the opposite direction to the way you are travelling. Again, this does sound quite complicated, but in practice it becomes very easy. Things get a little bit harder when we start moving towards or away a player. Again, another big thing which leads people to be quite scared of this game mode. But in the same way we give lead when we are going faster or slower than an opponent, you also add on minus range if you're moving towards or away from a player. So let's say that we're in a destroyer, firing against a big heavy cruiser that is moving slower than us. We are both moving towards each other, sailing towards the left hand side of the map. Because I'm faster than him and moving towards him, I would have to aim towards the right of him to make up for my faster speed, as well as aiming well below where he already is. Again, when you lay this out in a video or try and put it into theory, it sounds quite complicated, but it does become second nature very quickly into actually playing it. So I really wouldn't worry about it. So now we've covered all the basics, let's go in a little bit towards the meta and some tips on getting started. So as I suggested, I'd highly recommend picking up one of the very cheap premium destroyers. You can basically take your pick into whichever nation you prefer the most, but I'd say that by far, the United States has the strongest destroyer line in the game. However, the American Navy does suffer at top tier, as they are yet to have a competitive battleship. This may change in the future though, but by far, the United States Navy is the best tech tree to start with, at least for the destroyers. But in general, the German, Soviet and Japanese navies are the strongest in the game at top tier. So let's quickly go over the nations. The Americans are rather unique. They have fast firing 5-inch guns, combined with something called anti-fragmentation armour. This both gives them very good damage, as well as protection, as the anti-frag armour basically protects you from high explosive rounds, the main type of ammunition fired by destroyers. Because of this, if you are facing off against American destroyers, it's better to use semi-armour piercing shells, because as I said, traditional high explosive rounds are less effective against American destroyers. The German tree basically consists of oversized destroyers. This means they typically have much larger ships compared to other nations. This works very well in War Thunder, but in real life, they had a nasty habit of just rolling over in heavy seas. The Germans losing their expert shipbuilders at the end of World War I did have a heavy price on the performance of ships in World War II. But as I said, that's real life, not in War Thunder. In game, the German destroyers are very large and typically have much bigger guns compared to other destroyers. Whereas most other destroyers have 4-inch guns, the Germans are rocking 6 and 5-inch guns. This gives them a lot of power, but relatively poor fire rates. The Soviet Union is basically the complete opposite of the American territory. They have pretty bad destroyers, but have an excellent top tier lineup. The Soviets aren't the most new player friendly, and I wouldn't recommend grinding them as your first nation. The British, as always, are pretty much just all-rounders. They've got some very good destroyers in the early tiers, notably the J class and then later the Battle class, with very fast firing 4.7 inch and 4.5 inch guns. As I said, they tend to be well balanced between anti-ship and anti-air. Britain also has one of the best top tier lineups. However, compared to Germany and Japan, which we'll cover next, Britain doesn't have a World War II battleship. So, the Japanese. I'd say that when you're first starting the game, it really is a question between the United States Navy or the Imperial Japanese Navy. The American destroyers are typically known as gunboats, as their primary main of killing an opponent is using its naval firepower. This is different for the Japanese. They mainly design their destroyers to be used for a mass torpedo strike, with the infamous long lance torpedo. While if you look at any Japanese destroyer, notice that they have 6-inch guns, which is impressive, but they only have high explosive and high explosive time fused rounds, which aren't particularly effective in game. They also have very slow fire rates, making them largely ineffective as destroyers, and they play more like light cruisers, but they certainly don't have the survivability of a light cruiser. This makes the Japanese tech tree quite hard to play at the beginning, because they were basically specialised for night attack torpedo runs, which doesn't really translate into War Thunder. However, in the top tiers of the Japanese Navy, you have some absolutely stunning ships, the Hyuga and the Kongo, both of which I believe were ironically built in British shipyards. And then finally, we come on to the Italians, or the Italians if you're an American. I'm not going to lie to you, the Italian Navy is pretty much the weakest in the game. While they have a pretty good coastal lineup, the blue water fleet is pretty poor. The Italian destroyers are fast, but they don't really have good firepower or torpedoes, and top speed in War Thunder Naval isn't really that important. So I'm not really going to waste your time. I wouldn't bother grinding out the Italian Navy. And just before we finish, let's talk a little bit about ammunition. The majority of the destroyers, the ships that you will likely be fighting against if this is your first time playing Naval, basically have no armor whatsoever. They basically just have the structural steel on the outside of the ship. This means common high explosive rounds will rip straight through it. There are two exceptions however, American destroyers with their anti-frag armor, and the big German destroyers, which are generally just bigger than normal destroyers. Against these ships, you want to be firing semi-armor piercing if you have them. But against destroyers of the Soviet Union, British and Japanese type, you want to be firing basic high explosive. Now, there is a caveat to that. On some ships, you have something called high explosive variable timed. Although these rounds were designed for firing at aircraft, Gaijin has modelled them in a strange way. They actually work against ships. Now obviously the proximity fuse round doesn't work. They don't detonate above the ship and spoil the crew. They work basically just like normal high explosive rounds, except they have better splash damage, causing more damage to the actual ship. Again, this isn't realistic whatsoever. It's just an oddity that Gaijin have coded into the game, and it's been like this for literally years, so it's probably not going to be changed. So if you have high explosive variable time shells, basically use this as your default round, but carry some semi-armor piercing rounds in case you encounter either German or American destroyers. Another oddity is in the top tiers of War Thunder when you're talking about battleships and heavy cruisers. The semi-armor piercing rounds tend to do more damage than actual armor piercing rounds. They obviously don't have as high penetration, but they do more internal damage to a ship. Again, in real life this is just ludicrous, but I think because Gaijin have modelled the trajectory of shells with a well higher than normal flight path, it's basically just bugged. If you're in a battleship, fire semi-armor piercing by default. So lads, I'm aware that this video is getting quite long, but before we finish, I just want to talk about close air support. There are lots of planes that have very good bombs and torpedo loads in pretty much all tech trees. Pretty much with the exception of the Soviet Union, which for some reason didn't have any torpedo bombers. Anyway, just like in ground realistic, aircraft are an essential part of the naval battles. Get a few kills in a ship and then go out and cause some mayhem in a torpedo bomber. Good fun, they are very tricky to get close enough to drop the torpedo, but as I said, if you do manage to get a kill, it does feel very rewarding. So lads, that's it for my Naval 2022 guide, I guess. If you enjoyed the video, please do consider leaving a like and subscribing. And if you really liked it, consider becoming a channel member, like T, Biff Webster, Tomato Salad, Deboa LX, Just Someone, Destroyer 1805, Dr. Bob, Tans, William Tessier, and Lola Alfonsi. Thank you very much for watching the videos, lads, and I'll see you in the next video.